Thanks so much for coming. Well, you're supposed to come, but thank you so much for coming. You know, it's good to see faith in practice. Take you a little trip down memory lane. Remember when you were confirmed in the 5th grade, or really it could be a number of grades together, because it was when the bishop came that you really got confirmed. This has to be people my age or older. And what would happen is you would be preparing through all the years of preparation for confirmation, be memorizing questions and answers. And the bishop would walk down the aisle and would ask questions at random of the young people there. Remember, back then it was boys on one side, girls on the other, right? Blessed Mother side, St. Joseph's side. And also the confirming bishop would give you a slap. Remember that? Because you were supposed to be a soldier of Christ. Well, not everybody was able to answer all the questions sufficiently. And for that reason, lots of times the bishops who came would really do, softballs, like, who can tell me what the very first sacrament is whereon water is poured on your head while you are an infant? And then somebody go, baptism? Yes, baptism. And what is the next? And so that was pretty good, and we all relaxed. One bishop one time really got into it. He said, this is a true story. All stories are true, and some of them actually happened, but this really happened. He said, now, let's see what fine young man or young woman surely knows her faith this well. The promises made to Margaret Mary Alacoque that if you did the 9 consecutive First Fridays, 9 months in a row, what was the promise? One child raised his hand, stood up, very content that he knew this, and said, the promise was, in your final illness, a priest will die by your side. I guess a lot of people didn't know what the promise was. It was when you were dying, a priest would come to you so you could have absolution. And so they said, in your final illness, a priest will die by your side. 8 o'clock Mass, the 12 noon Mass laughed more at it. I think it was more their time frame, I suppose. But I mention this because when we receive the ashes today, even though there is the other blessing, which is turn from your sins and believe the good news, I always like that we hear the one, remember that you are dust and unto dust you shall return. Because in almost any day, as we try to apply the gospel, we always want to turn from sin and believe the good news. But at the beginning of Lent, I don't know what would make a stronger impression than the priest putting ashes on your forehead and saying, remember that you are dust and unto dust you shall return. In other words, bub, you're going to die. And that makes us all take life, I think, a bit more serious. The reason why I say that is not just because of the season of Lent, where we consider where we came from and where we are returning to. We come from God, we belong to God, we return to God. We are created in love by God, and we are forgiven in love by God. But it is the fact that I've had some friends over the years that have received very serious news from doctors, which has turned their whole life around, because suddenly they were under the very real realization that they have an illness that is so strong that they may not survive its ravages. I've got a friend of mine who's 75 years old. She's had breast cancer, and she's been going through the chemo and the radiation and all of the steps and everything that they have. I have a classmate of mine, a couple years older, who had melanoma, and he's been having chemo and radiation and infusion, and they're taking pieces out of him. And I have to tell you that in the midst of this news, they did not go back to living life the way they were before that news. In other words, it wasn't just eat, drink, and be merry because tomorrow we may die. It was, we may not have much time left. And so let's make the most of it. And what happened is the things that used to bother them so much no longer no longer makes the top 10, because now they're faced with the best of treatment. What would the life expectancy be? There's no cure. You can be in remission, but there's not a cure. And so it is important, I think, that we go through life with the knowledge that this is a gift that is only for a limited time. And neither you nor I know how much time we have ahead of us. If you do get to a certain age, you realize you've got much more behind you than ahead of you. But this isn't to make people morose or morbid. It's really to say, remember that life is precious, and living it faithfully is important. But not just important in terms of giving God his due of a goodly life, a godly life, but also because it is really the path to happiness in this world and the next. And that's why I really love the season of Lent. The word Lent comes from an Anglo-Saxon word meaning springtime, a time for rebirth, a time for renewal, a time for new life. And so that's why I think it's so precious and opportune that we are actually reminded, remember that you are dust, and unto dust you shall return. It helps us to take God, I think, more seriously, but also just life more seriously, when we become more aware from time to time of its limits. And sometimes it may not be that you yourself or somebody in your family has had a serious illness to make them suddenly have to reimagine and take stock of everything that they have in life so far and for now. It could be sometimes that the person that has been your neighbor, your friend, is suddenly has left this life. In which case it is a reminder to you and to me, hey, don't sweat the small stuff. God is with us in all things. Sometimes when push comes to shove, when we feel we're under pressure, we find it much easier to pray to God in our need than we do sometimes when everything is going well and we forget how much we need God, always, and in the first place. So without making it morbid, if we realize truly that we only have so much time on earth, then it should remind us in a good way, to make the time well spent.